They didn't choose you at random, no. There was something deliberate in the way they moved toward you, like moths to a flame they secretly resented. You were calm when they were chaotic. You were kind without needing applause. You carried wounds with dignity, while they wore masks to hide even the smallest bruise. You walked into rooms with quiet strength, and that was the threat, not your words, not your actions, but the unshakable presence you brought. You didn't play their games, yet you still won attention, loyalty, trust, things they craved but couldn't earn. So they did what the insecure always do when faced with someone they can't control. They targeted you, not because you were weak, but because you were unbreakable. The quiet power that threatened them you didn't need to shout to be heard. You didn't have to raise your voice, step on others, or parade your worth in glitter and noise. You moved like a river, calm, steady, undeniable, and that stillness, that quiet power, made them uneasy. Because in a world that thrives on validation, on chaos, on shallow impressions, you were proof that depth still exists. They saw it in the way you listened more than you spoke, in how you didn't need to dominate a room to leave an imprint. You were not loud, but you were noticed. And the ones who live off control, off manipulation, they don't fear the ones who shout. They fear the ones who see. Because you watched without judgment, you observed what others missed. You picked up on the pauses, the lies wrapped in charm, the desperation hidden beneath fake smiles, and that made you dangerous, not to the world, but to them. Because power disguised as noise is fragile. It crumbles under the gaze of someone who cannot be deceived. You, with your steady presence, with your quiet strength, didn't need to expose them. Your very existence already did. They targeted you because they couldn't understand how someone like you didn't need their approval, didn't bend under pressure, didn't rise to their bait. They provoked you just to prove you were like them. But you weren't, and that truth gnawed at them. You were calm in the storm, and to them that felt like resistance. You were at peace with yourself, and that made them face the war within themselves. Every time you stayed silent when they expected a reaction, it burned. Every time you showed grace where they'd show rage, it wounded their pride. They tested you not to know you better, but to break what they didn't understand. Because deep down they knew real power is not loud, it is not cruel, it does not need to conquer, it simply is. And you were that reminder, a living contrast to their chaos. So they pointed fingers. They spread doubt, they tried to twist your strengths into flaws. But here's the truth they'll never say out loud. They targeted you because they felt small in your presence. Not because you diminished them, but because they had built their identity on illusions. And you were the mirror they couldn't shatter. The power that threatened them was never about dominance. It was about stillness, clarity, and the kind of strength that doesn't demand attention, but commands it without a word. And that kind of power, it terrifies those who have none of their own. Your empathy was a mirror they couldn't face. It wasn't your intelligence that unsettled them. It wasn't your accomplishments, your confidence, or even your resilience. What truly unnerved them, what made you their target, was your empathy, the way you could look at a person and see through the performance, the way you offered understanding even when none was offered to you. You didn't just hear people, you felt them, and that, for someone hiding from themselves, is unbearable, because empathy is a mirror. It reflects not just who a person pretends to be, but who they truly are. And when they stood in front of you, your compassion didn't flatter their ego. It revealed their wounds, their guilt, their unresolved shame. You didn't accuse them, you didn't judge them, and yet somehow they felt exposed. That's the strange power of a heart that genuinely cares. It doesn't need to confront to convict. Just being in your presence made them aware of their own void. You could sense pain beneath anger, insecurity behind arrogance, sorrow under cruelty. You spoke gently, but your words held weight. Not because you tried to wound, but because you unknowingly touched nerves they tried to bury. And that's why they lashed out. Because some people don't want to be seen. They want to be worshipped. They don't want truth. They want approval, and you couldn't lie to them, Not with your words, not with your presence. Your empathy saw them clearly, and they hated you for it. They targeted you not because you were naive, but because you were too awake. You offered understanding where they expected confrontation, and that confused them. You gave kindness where they expected a fight, and that disarmed them. But more than anything, you made them feel vulnerable, and for people who survive by manipulation, vulnerability feels like death. So they painted your softness as weakness. They mocked your understanding as foolishness. They tried to make you feel small, so they wouldn't have to admit that it was your depth that made them feel hollow. You were not their enemy, but they treated you like one because you saw too much. You forgave too quickly. You believed too deeply, and they didn't know how to deal with someone who didn't wear a mask. So they threw stones not at your flaws, but at your light, hoping to dim what they couldn't replicate. And still you loved. You stayed kind. You kept showing up with open hands and an open heart, even when they came with daggers. Because empathy isn't something you do, it's who you are, and that's why they chose you. Not because you were easy to break, but because in breaking you, they hoped to silence the part of themselves your love made unbearable. But they never truly broke you. They only revealed the kind of strength that doesn't roar, but heals. And for some, there is no greater threat than a heart that sees everything and still chooses to love. They needed a canvas for their chaos. You weren't chosen because you were weak. You were chosen because you were steady, because you had a stillness that could absorb storms without flinching. You had the kind of emotional strength that others leaned on without even realizing it. And they, those who carried turmoil within them, saw that. They didn't want to fix their chaos, so they searched for someone to hold it, someone to pour it into, and you became their canvas, the one who could take their confusion, their frustration, their rage, and reflect it back without falling apart. But here's the unspoken truth. They didn't love you for your heart. They used it, not always consciously. Sometimes they told themselves they admired you, that you were their safe space, their anchor. And maybe for a while that was true. But when a person refuses to confront their own darkness, they eventually start resenting the light that tries to understand it. You became a container for what they couldn't process, a place to dump their fears, their jealousy, their bitterness, and because you loved deeply, you let them. You gave explanations when they gave silence. You stayed soft when they turned cold. You tried to fix what you didn't break. You kept showing up for people who wouldn't even meet you halfway, because you believed that love could heal, that kindness could reach them. But the truth is, some people don't want healing. They want escape, and they saw you as that escape. You became their emotional landfill, the place where they discarded everything they didn't want to face in themselves. And because you were calm, because you rarely lost control, they convinced themselves you could handle it. They projected onto you what they couldn't admit about themselves. Their guilt became your burden. Their mood became your responsibility. Their chaos became your norm. And every time you tried to speak up, they turned it around. Suddenly you were too sensitive, too emotional, overthinking. They invalidated your reality, not because you were wrong, but because they didn't want to face theirs. You were the mirror again, and this time they tried to break you to avoid seeing the cracks in themselves. But you held on longer than you should have, not out of weakness, but out of hope. You believed in their better self more than they did. You thought if you just loved a little harder, they'd come around. But you forgot something. Love isn't meant to be a sponge for destruction, and peace isn't built by absorbing other people's storms. They needed a canvas, yes, but you were never meant to be it. You were meant to be the artist, the one who paints healing, the one who turns wounds into wisdom. And now you know, not everyone who leans on you deserves that space. Your calm is sacred. Your energy is valuable. You're not here to carry everyone. You're here to protect the peace they tried to steal. They envied the light they couldn't replicate. It wasn't what you had. It was who you were that stirred something dark in them. You didn't walk into rooms needing to be seen. You simply existed, and somehow that was enough to draw attention. You never chased validation, and still people trusted you, respected you, admired you. Not because you tried to impress, but because you were real. Authentic, grounded, and for those who built their identity on illusions, on pretending, performing, manipulating, that authenticity was unbearable. You were a walking contradiction to everything they stood for. While they crafted a version of themselves that looked powerful on the outside but was hollow on the inside, you lived in alignment. You didn't need to fake joy because your peace was genuine. You didn't need to exaggerate your worth because you moved with quiet confidence. And that, more than anything, exposed the emptiness they tried to hide. They envied your light, not the spotlight, but the lightness of your spirit. The way you carried yourself without bitterness. The way you treated people with dignity, even when you had every reason not to. That kind of grace can't be imitated. It has to be lived, and they knew deep down that they didn't have it. So they resented you for having something they couldn't copy. And because they couldn't become it, they tried to destroy it. They gossiped, they lied, they planted seeds of doubt, hoping to dim your glow from the outside. But they misunderstood something. Your light was never external. It didn't come from praise or attention or applause. It came from struggle, from rising, from learning how to walk through darkness and still carry warmth. You weren't born glowing, you earned your light, and that's what made it unshakable. They didn't see the nights you cried in silence, the battles you fought in your mind, the betrayals you endured without becoming bitter. They only saw the strength, the peace, the joy, and they wanted it, but not the path that created it. So they tried shortcuts, imitation, attention, control. But light born from the soul can't be replicated. It exposes what's fake. That's why you became a threat. Not because you took anything from them, but because you reminded them of what they could never become unless they were willing to face themselves. And many people would rather destroy what's real than do the work of becoming it. You didn't provoke them with arrogance. You exposed them with grace. And for those addicted to masks, your presence felt like a spotlight on everything they were pretending not to be. That's why they targeted you. That's why they tried to make you doubt yourself, because the truth is, they always knew who you were. They just hoped you wouldn't figure it out, because once you do, once you stop shrinking, once you stop apologizing for your light, the illusion they live in begins to crack, and that terrifies them more than anything else. Your existence was a threat to their control. They didn't need you to fight them. They only needed you to see them, and that alone was enough to make you a problem. You didn't shout. You didn't expose them publicly, but you noticed the manipulation behind the kindness, the control hidden in compliments, the power games dressed as concern. You saw through it, and that made you dangerous, not to the world, but to them. Because people who operate in illusion can only thrive if no one challenges the script. They build their influence in subtle ways, through guilt, through gaslighting, through reshaping your reality until you question yourself. But you didn't fall for it, not fully. You may have doubted your feelings for a while, but deep down you knew. You saw the strings behind the curtain. You noticed how they shifted blame, how their apologies had conditions, how their love felt more like leverage. And when you started asking questions, when you stopped reacting the way they expected, they realized something terrifying. They were losing control. You weren't supposed to wake up. You weren't supposed to recognize the cage they dressed up as connection. You were meant to stay quiet, confused, dependent. But instead you began to remember who you were, and for them that was the ultimate threat. Because control is only effective when the target believes they are weak. But you weren't. You were aware. You started to question patterns, to set boundaries, to pull your energy back. And with every step you took toward truth, they grew more desperate. They twisted your strength into selfishness, your distance into betrayal, your boundaries into cruelty. But that's because they couldn't control you anymore, and people who rely on power over others will always resent the ones who choose freedom. You didn't scream, but your silence was louder than words. You didn't expose them, but your peace was proof they failed to break you. They couldn't manipulate you into staying small, so they tried to make you feel guilty for growing. But by then, it was too late. You had seen too much, and once you see the game, you can't unsee it. You were never theirs to control. Your worth was never tied to their approval, and the moment you stopped seeking their validation was the moment they lost their grip. That's why they targeted you, not because you were broken, but because you were waking up. Because you were reclaiming the parts of yourself they tried to suppress. And when you rise like that, not loud, but certain, those who survive by control can't follow. They'll label you cold, detached, heartless. But in truth, you've just become untouchable. And there is nothing more dangerous to a manipulator than someone who no longer fears their absence.